Maidens, which is obviously a huge success. We've just had 200 sign up so far, and we are going for another 200. Well, maybe our stressed vice president actually doesn't want another 200 sign-ups. But do sign up if you're new to college debating. Give it a go. It's great crack. You've nothing to lose. And if you win, you get to go to a final. And it's a lot of fun. So sign up to Maidens. Next week, we'll be debating the motion, "This House regrets the fall of religion." And we have a great lineup, including Peter Sexton, who's the very droll chaplain of this college, and various other guest speakers, and that'll be a great one to go to, so please do come to that. You may have seen that we got a post about the Phil on Trinder. Yeah, we're moving on up in the world here at the Phil. Someone was asking, is any man in the Phil straight, was the question. And our vice president put those allegations to rest when, for his choice for movie night, he put on Call Me By Your Name. And if you think movie night, I'd love to go to a movie night, well, next week at 7 o'clock on Tuesday, we'll be watching Brokeback Mountain, so come. I actually don't know what we'll be watching next week. Mr. Vice President, any suggestions?
It's a surprise.
It's a surprise, Cal Surprise. Well, let's watch something good, like Battle of Britain or something, something with a bit of moxie. Anyway, anything else I'm forgetting? Debate training, of course. If you would like to sign up and you want to get good at competitive debating, you don't have any interest in movies, you want to get good at debating, you're focused on what's actually important. Well, then on Wednesdays here, so not Wednesday, on Tuesdays, that's Tuesdays here in the HIS Convo for whatever reason, at 5 o'clock is novice training. If you're new to competitive debating, come along to that. Afterwards, at 6 to about 8:30, we have advanced training if you've got what it takes. If you're a woman or a gender minority, well, then feel free. That's just disrespectful. If that's your thing on Wednesday, then at 6 to 7:30, you can come to the Women and Gender Minorities training, or you can go to any training you want, but that's just a separate little space. Then there's a competitive debating group chat. You can sign up for that, and our emails, which you're all obviously getting because you're Phil members, you've given us your money. And sign-ups will begin to open for the Irish Times debating competition. We're doing that one again, but I'll keep quiet about that. So thank you very much, and there being no further business, the meeting was adjourned.
Are there any objections to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate record of the last private business meeting? There being none, I shall duly sign. Ms. Treasurer, are there any fines?
There are no fines.
Ms. Secretary, are there any reports to be read?
There are no reports to be read.
The time for questions is now open.
Ms. Secretary, are there any motions on notice?
There are no motions on notice.
Ms. Secretary, are there any motions not on notice?
There are no motions not on notice.
The time for questions is now closed.
That brings us on to general business of society. Are there any motions to be read in general business? There being none. There being no further business, this private business meeting is now adjourned. I invite our Secretary, Alana Maxwell, to retire and return with the speakers for tonight's debate. Call this House to order and call on the Registrar Jonathan Kelly to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
Thank you again. Forced to be brief, I'll keep this short. The last public business meeting of the University Philosophical Society took place last week, Thursday, 7:30, here in the G&B chamber. The motion, which was a rather depressing motion put before the House, was this House would engage in environmental terrorism. And to kick things off in first proposition, we had Jenny Salmon speaking. She is a UN youth delegate, and for about 10 minutes, as far as I could tell, she just simply read out her CV, which was quite interesting. But she raised some very good points about how we must take on the climate question. Then Rehan opened the case for the first opposition, and being a BP debater, it was what you might expect. But he did ask the question, he stated, I suppose, terrorism is not a good way to win your objectives, which put me in mind of Harry Hogan, my predecessor here in the Irish Times debating competition. He was debating environmental terrorism, and he asked the question, well, how many people were buying airplane tickets after 9/11? To a very, you could hear a pin drop apparently, but as you could now. But there you go. So that was Rehan, and then to continue the case was Nathan for the second proposition, who is a climate activist here at Trinity. I met him the next day giving out vegan biscuits. You could definitely taste the difference. You do, the Oreos, it's not the same without that creamy, filling. You do miss the dairy, but I didn't say it to him. I said it was delicious, and I signed his petition. But he was he was saying eco-terrorism is about attacking those who are responsible for the climate crisis, was what he was arguing, and that the time to act is now, which is something I'm sure we can all agree with. He also said climate change is not caused by tote bags, which a previous speaker suggested, but rather by the capitalist class. I was with him in the first half of that sentence, but there you go, felt somewhat attacked. And he said violence was accepted in World War II, so why not now, was his call to arms, and that was Nathan. Following along, we had Dr. Roy, an academic here in Trinity, who continued the case for the opposition, suggesting that terrorism, it's not all that's cracked up to be, we should go with civil disobedience. Then Annabella spoke for the proposition, again, well, more about the climate crisis. My notes are really thorough here. Then Amy Cox spoke for the third opposition, and she began her speech by saying, I'm very nervous. I don't want my speech to be memorable. Well, good job, Amy. You succeeded. I don't remember a single word of what she said. And then coming in to close the case for the proposition was Saoirse Exton, who, like any up-and-coming politician, she suggested, will no one think of the children, was her question. Well, fantastic stuff, Saoirse. She also asked, are terrorists the oppressors, or are they the oppressed? Interesting. I don't know if we got an answer to that question. And then finally, John Gibbons, an esteemed climate activist who's been in this field for many, many years, really brought the mood of the evening down. Could it even sink any further? I thought not, but he gave it a very good attempt. For example, 45,000 tons of CO2 pumped into the air, he says, is enough to kill one person. And Ireland last year alone emitted 68 million tons of carbon dioxide into the air. Shame on you with your tote bags, is what I say. Anyway, he went on, and it was actually genuinely very depressing. At the end, he said, my generation, I quote, has fucked it. You have to eat a massive shit sandwich. I apologise on behalf of my generation. Thank you, John. The motion, the motion indeed tonight will be put before the House. The motion put before the House, and the nays had it, so the motion fell. And there you go, that was last week's exhilarating debate, and I'm sure I speak for everyone in this room when I say I look forward to another exhilarating debate tonight. Whether the motion passes or falls, well, depends on the strength of your arguments and the mood of the room. I will not talk about my views on the EU. I don't think you kids are ready for it yet. But anyway, so there being no further business, the meeting was adjourned. Thank you. Looking at me, she's killing me anyway, because I may have accidentally 2 bottles of wine fell into my bag previously, and I'm borrowing it indefinitely, and she's really killing me. But she wants me to say that after the wine reception here tonight, folks, we're going to Mary's Bar on Wicklow Street, I believe, for some afters, and we'd love to see as many faces there as we can.
Are there any objections to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate record of the last public business meeting? There being none, I shall duly sign. Welcome everyone to the University Philosophical Society. As you can probably tell by my lack of face bush, I am not Jack Palmer. I am Killian. I am the VP of the Phil. The motion that stands before the House this night is this House believes the EU should side with China over the US. Speeches for students are a maximum of 7 minutes, and for our guest speakers they are a maximum of 10. After the first minute and for the last minute of each speech, which will be signified by a bell, Speakers from opposing sides and audience members are free to offer points of information. We encourage general audience participation during our debate, so if you hear something you agree with, you can shout "Hear, hear," or "Make America Great Again." And if you hear something you don't like, you can shout "Shame." We prioritize respect during our debate, so if anyone has any concerns with things that are said tonight, our handsome SMC, Max in the corner here, he will be around at the reception all evening and is contactable via smc@tcdphil.com. Alternatively, our president, Jack, is contactable via president@tcdphil.com. Right, we'll introduce the teams. On Proposition Bench, on Team Mao, we have Finn McGrath, Chair of the Robinson Subcommittee of the HIST. We have Professor Nathan Hill, Sam Lam Professor in Chinese Studies and currently the Director of Trinity Centre for Asian Studies. And we have Anna Kollar, Hungarian, Calvinist, Communist, and Slayer of Stephen O'Sullivan. On the opposition bench, on Team Freedom, we have Professor Kiri Paramore, Professor of Asian Studies in the National University of Ireland, University College Cork, where he directs the Irish Institute of Chinese Studies and the Irish Institute of Japanese Studies. His expertise lies in the politics and history of East Asia, with a focus on interaction between politics and culture. We have Wilbur Zuan, who is a member of our UDOMA subcommittee, I believe. Yeah. And we have Professor Catherine Jones, a Professor of International Relations at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Catherine Jones teaches and researches on issues of security and development in East Asia. So here's to a great debate, guys. Best of luck. It's going to be a fun one. And yeah, let's get going. I invite Finn McGrath to open for side proposition.
Evening, everyone. I am doing my master's in Chinese studies, but a disclaimer, it is only week 4, so I haven't learned that much about China yet. For example, in my history module, we've only got as far as the 1920s, so like no spoilers. We just introduced this guy called Mao Zedong, who sounds really cool. I hope that I'm really excited to see where that goes. I'm sure it won't lead to like multiple national disasters or anything crazy like that. But yeah, before I tell you guys why I'm definitely right about the future of China, because I know everything there is to know, with my massive experience or whatever, I'm going to go to the other side of the debate first and talk about why America bad. That is all my notes actually say. But you really don't need me to tell you why America bad, because the writer's strike is just over. Yep, the writers. And John Oliver is back. So congratulations, Trinity students. You now have your steady supply of not so fun facts about the slow disintegration of the fabric of American society and the slow collapse of their imperial order. Now that it's back on YouTube, you can sort of catch up and pretend you're up to date on all things US politics. I'm actually surprised he isn't here to tell you about it himself, because when I first read the Phil guest list for the year, I thought I was looking at Jack Palmer's YouTube like subscribed page. But in all seriousness, America bad. And from an EU perspective, America, get this, bad. Right, so in particular, as it relates to China, America is bad. The US can see that China's economy is struggling, which is true, right? The Chinese economy is facing some very serious challenges at the moment, and it remains to be seen whether it can actually navigate those successfully. But the US sees this as an opportunity, right? They see things are already tough in China, and they're trying to make them as difficult as possible. It's leaning on them economically and politically, trying to ratchet up tensions through rhetoric and through economic policy. And I know this sounds very like conspiratorial or whatever, but we always talk about China and politics in China in these terms as well, right? We are always like, oh, what are the Chinese up to? And like the racism should not be lost on anyone as to like why that is the case. So it's only fair that we talk about US politics in the same terms, because there isn't as much of a difference as you might think between how those two countries conduct their business. So this leaning on America, from America on China, is playing into Xi Jinping's hands. And again, it's week 4, but from what I can tell so far, this Xi Jinping guy, kind of bad, like kind of a bad dude. But the one thing that really stuck out to me from my course is that all the Chinese students in my course kind of think she is like a little bit of a joke. You know, like the lecturer will say, oh, Xi Jinping, well, why do you think he's a good communist? And then they'll all be like, oh, that's so funny, good one. And I'll be like, yeah, delete TikTok off my phone. Yeah, good one. But I do think it's that they view Xi in a similar way to we see someone like Donald Trump, right? Dangerous, yes, but ultimately kind of funny, because they're all the same genre, like these guys, Xi, Putin, Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro. Yes, they're like a danger to the world and democracy and whatever, but they're all the same genre of like pathetic dude, where they have a big ego and they don't like to be criticized and they want you to see how tough they are. Xi Jinping daddy issues, I'm not ruling it out. And when you learn a bit about Xi Jinping's dad, it actually starts to really add up. The US is pressuring this guy, and it's feeding into those tendencies, and that's why a war in Taiwan seems so depressingly likely, because we saw what Putin did in a very similar situation, right? And if you talk to people from countries bordering the US and Russia, they'll sort of say, you know, their attitude is, what did you expect? You know, this kind of guy and this kind of background that he's working with, it was always going to end up this way. So, we've got two superpowers spoiling for a fight, and it really matters where the EU goes on this. And we got to learn our lessons from Ukraine quickly, and we cannot give Xi, or I guess China, the space to make a really destructive insular turn, right? So if the EU takes China's side, okay, what does that mean? Politically and economically, it means getting closer to China rather than imposing sanctions and escalating tensions like the US wants us to do. For example, the EU can double down on academic cooperation, which was at its peak in sort of the mid-2010s and has been on the decline ever since, especially in the area of like science and STEM. And this did exist before, and there's been this subtle shift away from it. Another topic, if the EU really wants to support China, it can help in the reshaping of its energy sector, especially when it comes to the global effort to fight climate change, where China sees itself as a leader among developing countries, which are the most affected by climate change. And you know, there's this EU-China, like if they really put their heads together, they could actually fund the green transition if they want to. There is like a really untapped potential in that alliance. And it can be built on issues that are already pieces of consensus, right? The EU and China want to insulate themselves from climate change and like energy shocks like are happening in Russia. The US doesn't seem that concerned about it. They're more busy fighting about like whether there should be trans people doing drag shows for children, or like I don't know, like the Whopper song from the Burger King ad, I guess. And I know the response to this, right, where I'm talking about like things that the EU and China have in common. The response to that is always like, oh, what about human rights? And like, listen, I could talk about this for hours, but basically, in short, human rights as a concept or as like a theory of justice have really got like no purchase in China, and they really haven't for a while now. The reasons for that have been offered in a bunch of different places. Some people blame, not blame, but like attribute it to Confucianism or communism, or like for whatever reason the May 4th writers were really into Rousseau and not Locke. I'm not sure why that was. I'm going to do some more research. But basically, right, the paradigm of human rights doesn't have the same purchase in China as it does here in like the West or whatever. But if the EU insists on continuing to use that paradigm, if we continue to see all of China's social issues, which are many, right, in like the same lens always, we're not actually going to do anything. We're going to just double down on the problems. We're going to further isolate China. And if you want to make things better for Chinese minorities, and you want to make things better for Chinese citizens, you have to adapt. You have to be flexible. And that is possible. Stop trying to make fetch happen. Stop trying to make human rights happen in China, right? Not in terms of like what they actually achieve, but in terms of the approach and the rhetoric about it, because that's all the EU's relationship with the US necessarily has to be. It's just rhetorical, and we can change it, and we should change it, and you should propose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Finn, for that fine speech. I now invite Professor Kiri Paramore to open for side opposition.
What a pleasure it is to speak here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Finn, you're absolutely right. The United States is ratcheting up tension against China, and we have to decide which side it's best to be on. But let's just think about this proposition for a minute. the European Union should side with China over the US. The European Union. This is not some tin pot little country who has to choose between the two great big daddies. This is the European Union. So the first argument I'm going to make tonight is that this proposition is rather problematic in the way it is framed. And the second argument I'm going to make is that even if we accept the framing of this proposition, it is wrong. The framing of this proposition is the framing of the MSS, the mainstream media. It looks at geopolitics like a football match with two sides. But things are a little bit more complex than that. Sure, the USA is the global hegemon, we all know that. And sure, the USA and China have more GDP now than the European Union. But we live in Ireland, most of us, and we know that despite being the second richest country in the world, also in terms of purchasing power, maybe that doesn't mean so much. And the reason why we live in a rather impoverished country, despite having a huge GDP, is that centuries of poverty cannot be fixed by 1 or 2 years of high economic growth. Because hospitals and housing and infrastructure and clean water take decades, possibly centuries of those types of figures to fix. So yeah, China has a bigger purchasing power parity than any of these other big blocs. But they got to spend a lot of that money on really basic things, and we know what that's all about. I'm from Cork. I live in Cork now, you know, like, you should see the colour of the water that comes out of my tap. So the EU, by contrast, most of the EU, the big parts of the EU, where I used to live in the Netherlands, Germany, France, these have been rich for a long, long time. And that means that purchasing power they do have, that's consumer power. And that is the might of the European Union, is its consumer power. And we see that if we think, okay, the US is the big global hegemon. Has any country recently actually been able to influence the US? Actually been able to restrain US power? Who's heard of the Brussels effect? The idea that European regulation can affect the entire world and can restrict US capital. And that's happened. Things like electric cars, for instance, right? Where Toyota and a whole bunch of other people were doing hybrid. Volkswagen went for not hybrid, plug-in. The European Union said, we don't consider hybrid environmentally friendly. End of story. That's just one example. So this is not about all these IR theories about threat. This is real things that really happened. And this is just one example of where the EU actually affects the world, including the USA. And it does this in a variety of other ways. Has China ever limited the power of the United States of America? Again, not in theory, in reality. Yeah, sure, in the Korean War, before the 1980s, they supported Vietnam, they supported the guys fighting against apartheid in South Africa and that kind of thing. But since 1980, when China so-called opened up and embraced capitalism and so forth, has China ever since then restricted American power even by a millimetre? Possibly the greatest living historian of modern China, Prasenjit Duara, actually said in 2013, China, since Deng Xiaoping, since about the 1980 when China opened up, is just another US satellite state, a manufacturing base and military surrogate. And think what you use that's made in China. Think about America. They're big factories that produce cheap goods for American people and they enjoy them, right? Just like Korea and Japan did before and Taiwan. And militarily, remember when relations really got good between Vietnam and the United States? Deng Xiaoping was visiting the USA. And of course, 1979 it was, the famous Chinese invasion of Vietnam. And it was carried out the same week that Deng Xiaoping visited the US with a little gift for his imperial master, offered up over cocktails in the White House, where Deng Xiaoping, as one imperialist to another, leaned over to Jimmy Carter and said, 小朋友不听话，该打打屁股了. The little kid has been naughty, and they should be punished. They should have their body smacked. And within days, the tanks rolled over the border into Vietnam, and the Vietnamese had their bums spanked for having dared to defeat the United States in a war. So that's the reality of history. So this idea that China rather than the EU is the potential threat to the USA, the framing of this proposition is problematic. Now, even if, my second argument, even if the EU was somehow just some little kid looking for daddy, a sort of slightly larger version of Australia, even then the proposition that the EU should side with China is wrong. And that is because, as alluded, well, firstly because America's stronger, and this is my inner Australian coming out, if somebody's going to win, get on their side, right? But also because of our European values. Our European values. You might be wondering, what are they? Well, luckily, exactly this time last year, Josep Borrell, our foreign minister, you might not know who he is, but Vice President of the European Commission and the Foreign Minister of the European Union, he told us what it was, quote, "Europe is a garden. We've built a garden. Everything works. It's the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build. The rest of the world," he went on, "is not exactly a garden. Most of the rest of the world is a jungle." And the jungle could invade the garden! Which is basically saying, I'm all right, Jack. In other words, we're rich, let's pull that ladder up behind us. And that is what the European Union represents. And God, thank God, a few years ago I got Dutch citizenship and I'm part of it. You should see what the salary of a professor in the National University of Ireland is. I can hardly believe my luck, it's wonderful. These are our economic values. So, and if you want to know if it's not just this person, I mean, look at the facts. Look at the Doha round of the World Trade Organization around 2008, where the US and Japan supported the lead of the European Union in stopping the liberalisation of international trade, a liberalisation process that had dragged millions of people out of poverty since the 1970s, 80s. They stopped that process. The liberal democratic states stopped trade liberalisation. They stopped the equalisation in poverty across the world that had been happening. You know, I won't go into more than that. They said no more of that, no more of this alleviation of poverty through global trade. People talk about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but the space for that initiative was taken when our European values prevailed, protectionism prevailed, and we broke down the Western liberal models of economic equalisation. The EU today is about extracting and exploiting primary resources in the global south. And that is why the EU has the most protected market in the world. Of course, we use ideas like human rights to justify protectionist trade policy, particularly in the Middle East and Africa. And sure, that creates a hopeless cycle of poverty with no access to the rich markets in Europe or the infrastructure which would allow those countries to trade their way out into a developmental trajectory. And when challenged, EU's countries like the France and UK, when they were members, were happy to use unilateral military force against sovereign states, as little Macron seems very keen to do right now in Niger, and as they did in Libya and Syria. And of course, this is another value that we share with the United States. China, sadly, does not share our values. They do not share our European values. Therefore, if the EU must deal with anyone from the jungle, then surely it must be the US, who at least, albeit usually under congressional pressure triggered by paid industrial lobby groups, shares our core value of trade protectionism, which keeps us rich. To side with China over the US would be to open the gates to our beautiful garden, to betray our values, our culture, our democracy, to the jungle of poverty alleviation, multilateralism and human development. This House must stand over European values, and we must reject this proposition. Thank you.
That fantastic speech, and I invite Nathan Hill to continue for side proposition.
So in my hurry to put on my black tie, I forgot my reading glasses. And I'm very hard of seeing, so I think that my speech will have much less of the flair of Kiri's, but I'm very grateful to him for essentially making my case for me. And I think the biggest disagreement we have in terms of deciding, so we agree, support the winner, and the argument I have to make is simply that we should, in deciding on the winner, play the long game. So I'll start by observing that it is unhelpful to conceive of states as analogous to biological persons. We can and we must ask of a country whether its policies promote the welfare of its citizens and to what extent they're compatible with the welfare of citizens of other countries. But to ask whether their policies are moral, just, or right, this would have meaning only for casuists or for demagogues. As such, I have nothing to say about democratic values or human rights. I understand today's question as about the material interests of the overwhelming majority of the citizens of the European Union, today and for the immediately foreseeable future. The answer is clear. The US is a rapidly declining power, and China is on the rise. If, for reasons of nostalgia, identity, or ideology, the EU privileges its relationship with the US, it nails its colors to the mast of a sinking ship. Measured by current GDP, the US may be the world's richest country, but China stands already in second place, and adjusted for purchasing power parity, China is already on top. Anyone who's traveled to China recently will testify that in some respects, China is already ahead of the West, in some respects and in some regions. For example, China has 42,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. That's 3 centimeters a person. Whereas the US has 80 kilometers. That's 1/4 of 1 millimeter per person. Since 1982, China has lifted 800 million of its citizens out of poverty, and through its Belt and Road Initiative and its participation in the New Development Bank, it is helping other countries to do likewise. Now, some may say that this debt trap diplomacy is just a sinister ploy for world domination. And I say, maybe they're right. But the structural adjustments of the IMF and the dollar-denominated loans from the World Bank have so far only exacerbated global inequality and worsened poverty, especially in Africa. Competition in the provision of development finance should be welcomed by everyone. And objectively, China is offering more favorable terms than the US and its Bretton Woods lackeys. As elsewhere, China's economic development has come at an environmental cost. China has the world's largest carbon footprint, with the US in second place, although in per capita terms, China stands in 7th, the US in 2nd, with only Saudi Arabia ahead. However, there are signs that China may soon turn the corner towards a green economy. At the close of 2020, China boasted 253 gigawatts of photovoltaic capacity, a third of the world's total. 2 years later, the US has achieved less than half of this capacity, with only 110 gigawatts. Also, last year, 30% of new cars sold in China were electric. Compare that to the 7% of the US. China holds the potential not only to contribute to a greener, but also to a safer future. And this is where I think Kiri and I would most agree. The United States has the largest military in the world and rarely hesitates to use it. Wars of aggression cost 1.35 million lives in Vietnam, 650,000 in Iraq, 200,000 in Afghanistan. Since 1970, the US has financed or militarily supported so-called regime change in Colombia, Chile, Bolivia, Ethiopia, Angola, East Timor, Argentina, Poland, Chad, Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, Zaire, Yugoslavia, Kyrgyzstan, the Palestinian Authority of Libya, and Pakistan. Okay. It has done so twice in Syria, Haiti, and Afghanistan, and 3 times in Iraq. Thus, on average, the US destabilizes a country every 2 years. Even setting aside the human costs, these US military adventures are typically failures, purely in military terms. This year, the US military budget amounted to $847 billion, 4 times China's in absolute terms, and 17 times China's per capita. In face of such mind-boggling costs, to me, the bungled invasion of Venezuela in 2020 comically underlined the bankruptcy of the US's pretense to be the world's policeman. The sooner the US realizes its limits, the safer we all will sleep. The US habitually runs nuclear submarines up and down China's coastline, just outside China's territorial waters. To recognize the remarkable restraint that China shows in the face of this overt provocation, one need only imagine how the US would react if China did anything remotely similar. In contrast, China last saw war in 1979, as we just heard, as America's lackey, when it invaded Vietnam, with a combined cost to both sides of 70,000 lives. That's it. Since 1970. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, but what about Tibet and Xinjiang? Now, I've spent the whole of my academic career studying Tibet, and I have no intention of making light of the dire situation in these areas. Nonetheless, these situations have absolutely no bearing on the welfare of EU citizens. In short, China broadly keeps to international norms, whereas the US is a petulant thug. From the viewpoint of global peace, China is unambiguously the more reliable partner. Now, members of the audience may feel that I have cherry-picked a few facts that cast China in a positive light and cast the US in an unfavorable light. So let me emphasize that none of these facts, even all of them taken together, are the reason why I think the House should vote in favor of the motion. Instead, I draw this conclusion from the long-term course of global history itself. The scholarship of world systems theory, particularly Giovanni Arrighi's The Long 20th Century, published in 1994, argues that since the time wage labor came to predominate as the social institution for organizing production, world history can be divided into 3 distinct phases, each associated with the rise and the subsequent decline of a hegemonic power. In the 17th century, this power was the United Provinces of the Netherlands. Throughout most of the 18th and the 19th century, it was the UK. And in the 20th century, the US was the unambiguous hegemon. In each case, this power rose on the back of an unusually productive manufacturing section, was sustained through control of world commerce, and as each respective power slowly declined, it enjoyed an afterlife as a hub of finance. So we can see right now, UK, hub of finance, US, still in control of global commerce, China, major manufacturing power. This arc of industrialization, commercialization, and financialization also coincides with an ideological zigzag from protectionism to free trade, back to protectionism. If globalization and deregulation were the path to mutual prosperity and world peace, as we incessantly heard from 1980 until the global pandemic, why in 2023 do we hear loud calls for export bans to China and tariffs on Chinese goods? The answer is that the US has shed its mantle of hegemony and is settling in for its long decline. The EU can either join the US in its bellicose dotage, or it can join China in proactively shaping a prosperous, sustainable, and peaceful community of shared destiny for mankind.
Thank you, Nate, for that great speech. And now invite Wilbur to continue to recite opposition.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Wilbur. It's my first time speaking here. And unlike Finn, who just finished his 4th week of Chinese study, I unfortunately dropped out of Chinese study when I was 16. But still, I think I'm still 100% made in China, like most of these seeds that are produced here. So I feel like I have a decent understanding about this manufacturing that's produced me. And as we all know, Phil Society has like a long time tradition for inviting politicians into this debate. And I'm genuinely surprised that no one even mentioned that Xi Jinping should be invited. So I kind of had this idea like last week. I feel like maybe I should direct message him on Instagram or something. Something like, hey, dear President, I'm delighted to inform you that our propaganda finally bears its fruit. These Western kids see the true color of American fake democracy and ready to embrace your great leadership. Thursday, Trinity Dublin at 7:30. Text me back. Bye. And I realized one thing. This guy, he doesn't even own an Instagram account. And instead, he doesn't own any Western social media account. Like this great professor from Cork, I forgot his name, said. The country between EU and China, they're so culturally different. Like, it's great that the professor from Trinity, again, I forgot his name, mentioned that we can have this, like, a lot of this political and economic cooperation together. Like, for example, he pointed out that our family actually owns 9 centimeters of the railway in China, which we're gonna greatly benefit from it. However, I mean, this relationship between America and China is not purely based on economic and political relationship. There's a great cultural consensus between the two parties. For example, I'm sure a lot of you know or talk to a lot of American friends or relatives. You've probably seen millions of Hollywood movies, and you probably laughed about Donald Trump lately. But how much you know about China? From my own experience, very little. You know what's the 3 commonly asked questions for me as a Chinese? First one, do you know Kung Fu? Second one, do you eat dog? Third one, do you flush the second child down the toilet? Like, I don't blame you for that, because for decades, the Chinese government is trying to exclude our generation from the rest of the world. So social media, as an example, like, we don't use anything called like Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, and anything you can name of. And in fact, the only overlap I can think of is TikTok. I think we should imagine a world where we assign all the TikTokers as our ambassadors. So the first point is, like the doctor mentioned, the two worlds are too culturally excluded, and there's no way that the EU can make the EU kids bounce with Chinese kids. So this cooperation purely based on political or economic relationships is not gonna happen if the population does not agree with each other. Right, and here's the second point. So I've been watching this show lately. It's called Shameless. It's a great show, by the way. Right, so why I'm throwing at this, it's a show about this descendant American-Irish family in the south side of Chicago where they have an alcoholic dad and a bipolar mom, which I find is a great metaphor for this situation about China and America. America is obviously alcoholic, as we all acknowledge. And it always acts for its best interest. But on the other hand, do you know that as someone who lived in China for 16 years, I think this country is officially diagnosed as bipolar. So I brought this today. This is one of the things my parents, they got from China recently. You know what it is? It's called the Glory Certificate for being a single child. I got this when I was born. This is the pride that the government grants me and my family for being the honorable single child and contributed to this, country population. And the thing is, thanks to that policy, I'll never have to fight for a shower room ever in my life. However, 2 years ago, the government changed their attitude. And now they are telling us it's great to have 3 children in a family. There used to be this jingle everywhere in China, so 1 child is the best, and the government pays you when you get old. And now it changed in something like, you need 3 children because no one's gonna pay you when you get old. And I can tell you that China has this policy overturned all the way throughout history. Like we mentioned about the Vietnam War. We used to support the Vietnamese, and one day we decide we're gonna kick their ass. And also, say for the COVID restriction, for example, we used to have the strictest COVID policy, and suddenly we decided to lift all the restrictions one day, and we let the virus spread everywhere, as we can imagine. And I can't help but to think of our dear friendly neighbor, Russia, who kind of suffer from the same mental disease. So Russia had signed a treaty with the EU in 2014, and promised it would not invade Ukraine, as far as I know. And I think I don't have to overemphasize that damage it caused on the EU. As we all agree, we are talking about the biggest benefit for the EU. And the question is, to what extent will EU ready to cooperate with China, as everything as our proposition side has mentioned? All these green energy proposition, all these economic benefit. To what extent we will trust China as a bipolar illness, mental illness country, to agree on this policy and keep fulfilling its promises? So I think one of the biggest advantage for America is it's far more predictable than China, believe it or not. And I think that is why EU should maintain a long-term relationship with it. So back to this show, Shameless, for example. Who is the better parent? Compared to the constant irrational mom, I think the genuinely selfish dad is always a more accountable person. And that is the end of my speech. Thank you, everyone.
Great speech, and now we invite Anna Collar to close her side proposition.
Alone I stand in the autumn cold, on the tip of the orange island, the river flowing northward, eagles cleave the air, fish glide in the limpid deep. Under freezing skies, 1 million creatures contend in freedom. Brooding over this immensity, I ask, in this boundless land, who rules over man's destiny? No, this was not written by an arts block lad who went to Wicklow once and promised to quit smoking, but rather Mao Zedong. Comrades and counter-revolutionary forces who might be present tonight, like Potsdam's party enemies, bureaucratic state apparatuses, Germans and our Westerners, the current leaders of the EU, Leo Varadkar, people engaging in bourgeois decadence of discourse, the PAV and other entities promoting alcohol consumption among the working class, Linda Doyle, other left-wing radicals with a slightly different worldview than mine, Irish weather, Macron, the bourgeoisie, post-90s Labour, the SU, the ghost of Trotsky, the ghost... RTE, the Fianna Fáil Fine Gael coalition, the Gardaí, and most importantly, best students. The Phil has invited me, a Hungarian Calvinist communist, to give you thoughts on my perspective on the EU. And honestly, that's a high risk, low return investment. Like fair play, I wouldn't have invited myself. So, this motion asks us tonight what we want the future of the EU to be like. Comrades, the answer is simple. Fully automated luxury gay space communism. That is the end our heart desires. But what is our means to achieve this? Revolution. But, to quote Mao, who are our enemies? Who are our friends? This is a question of the first importance of the revolution. The basic reason why all previous revolutionary struggles in Europe achieved so little was their failure to unite with real friends in order to attack real enemies. I believe with lukewarm, comradely passion that China is our friend and has many assets to bring to the table to achieve gay space communism. First thing, space. China is world-renowned for its space exploration. We need to occupy other planets for two revolutionary reasons. Most importantly, so we can have a place to escape to once polar bears and other animals on the verge of extinction develop revolutionary consciousness and unionize against us with weapons and shit. I'm not sure about you, but the size of spiders in Ireland just keeps increasing. So I think this process has already begun. But space is also really important, so we can send people into exile. In the case of Ireland, once the revolution succeeds, we will sentence all Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael forces, as well as whoever shut down all the railways, to Mars on exile for 10 years. On good behavior, these politicians can be freed sooner if they figure out how communal property works, or they establish a decentralized autonomous community on Mars. Secondly, we need to achieve full automation. China has always led technological innovation. Paper, gunpowder, the clock, and compass are all Chinese innovations. And of course, some other stuff that I know little about, like bullet trains, Jesus, I cannot remember, aeronautics, nuclear physics, and of course AI, which I never use to write my essays. And I don't encourage anybody to pay $20 for the new ChatGPT. My second argument is that the revolution needs to get rid of at least two things, very horrible things. And China can teach us a lot about the know-how. First, landlords. Once the masses have their organization, the first thing they need to do is smash the political prestige and power of the landlord class, and especially of the local tyrants and evil gentry, that is, to pull down landlord authority and build up communal authority in society. I'm not just saying that because yesterday at a protest I fell in love with the Revolutionary Housing League guy, but also because I live in Dublin. €1,000 for a room? Nuh-uh. As James Joyce put it, too many landlords in the dole. That's why rents will never fall. And the second thing, and this even might be a bit more important, I read Mao for so long, and I finally discovered this thing, flower drums, the biggest evil of society. But honestly, I didn't know what they were to begin with, but I read further, and then as Mao writes, all vulgar performances shall be forbidden in all places. And now when it comes to vulgar performances, I'm not sure about flower drums, but if it means that we can get rid of the trinitones, I'm all for it. So yeah, that's mostly what I wanted to say. If you're for fully automated, gay space communism, please vote for the proposition.
Thank you, Anna, for that great speech. And we would like Professor Catherine Jones to close her side opposition.
All right. Good evening, everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation. This has been a fascinating evening. I've heard many interesting things. I may not repeat very many of them for very good reasons. I want to return us to the starting point of this debate. This House believes the EU should side with China over the United States. But ask yourselves this question: what is the EU supposed to be trying to achieve by siding with either China or the United States? In what will probably be my only sporting metaphor I ever use in my life, I think the EU should be trying to play the field. This isn't a story about gardens and jungles, and if it was, the proposition would be trying to draw you up the garden path and dump you in the jungle. This is a story about the EU trying to make a path for itself and trying to have some decision-making power on its own, which is a fallacy in itself. I live in the sunny uplands in Scotland, where somebody in my country at some point made a decision that we would be better off outside of this nonsense called the European Union. A decision that I believe, and still continue to believe, was somewhat mad. But so the journalists in the rest of the UK would lead me to believe the crackpots in Brussels can't make a decent decision to save their lives. And it's not just those in Brussels. It's within capitals within the EU. Merely 4 days ago, we had Germany claiming that it welcomes China's support for the G20 debt restructuring framework for poorer countries. Grand. At the same time, Olaf Scholz was saying we need to reduce critical dependencies in the future with China. Well, which one did it? Are we working with China? Are we embracing China? Are we hugging the panda? One of the things that the proposition has tried to tell you tonight is things will be a lot better if we side with what they believe to be the winner in a competition between China and the United States, and that winner would be China. But hugging that bear, that's not really a bear, hasn't worked. Germany's engagement with China through businesses, through critical key businesses for Germany like VW, has not changed or shaped lives in the way that the German manufacturers might have intended it to. The Italians signed an MOU on the Belt and Road Initiative. Some people seem to suggest that they only did this in order to win more money from, yes, you've guessed it, the European Union. Because by playing China and the United States and the European Union Centre off against one another, they could win a better package for themselves. And what I think is that the EU needs to do the same. It needs to play one side against the other in order to win the best deal from both. But it needs to do that because it couldn't possibly make it work to choose a side. It doesn't have the power. Kiri flamboyantly and very passionately set out the case for you that this isn't a matter of taking sides. No, because the EU can't. We have the issue that Eastern European states would not make the same choice as Germany, France, or Ireland. How would they resolve the difference? This would lead to fracturing, difference, division within the EU as a bloc. And therefore the EU cannot make a decision to choose between the United States or China. It has to somehow forge a middle ground. Not only that, it's classically, as we also heard from Kerry say, this is classically what the EU does. The inbuilt hypocrisy of EU values, whereby we want to pull the rug up from underneath everybody else to make sure our position at the top of the tree is firm, if you'll excuse that mixed metaphors of rugs and trees. So the EU needs to adopt this centre position. It needs to avoid being drawn into a side. But if we accept the fact that it is at some point going to be placed into the position of having to have a side, that eventually conflict and tension is going to mount up between the US and China to such a degree that not choosing a side is going to become impossible. The European Union has already chosen. I was told you like a bit of audience participation tonight. How many of you have got WhatsApp on your phone? That's quite a lot of people. How many of you have got WeChat on your phone? I'm afraid you've already made your choice. You've tied yourself, knowingly or unknowingly, to a digital technology platform that will tie you in and make it very difficult to switch. That exists not just in the realm of WhatsApp or WeChat, that is in the realm of cloud economies. If you have uploaded vast amounts of your data to Microsoft Cloud or whatever the thing's called, I don't use it, I use paper. You will find it very difficult to transfer to a new cloud computing technology. The path dependency that has been put in place by both the US and the EU as a collective combined entity has built your path for you without you making any decision whatsoever, other than to say, I'm going to download this app rather than that app. No. On top of that, the defence of the EU, the extent of its borders, is so heavily tied into supply chain networks and defence contracting with the United States. One of the biggest challenges in understanding the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has been, why is it that states, for example, Vietnam, has been mentioned a number of times, why is it that places like Vietnam, Indonesia and others have struggled to come out with a clear statement saying, we're opposed to this war against Ukraine? Well, have a look at Vietnam's defence industry. Nearly 90% of Vietnam's military capacity comes from Russia or the former Soviet Union. This isn't just about mere interoperability. This isn't just about buying bullets and guns from somebody different. This is about an entirely different training platform that will take years, if not decades, to change. Now, Vietnam might not make that same decision today, but it will take a long time for the European Union to separate itself from a defence industry that's tied in so heavily with the United States. On top of that, it's not like China has a credible offer as an alternative. It's not setting itself up to be a vast defence expender. It is not setting itself up to be a vast armament industry. And therefore, you're saying, I would move away from my happy security blanket of the United States and all of its expensive weapons and leave myself potentially exposed in a world where I'm not certain where I'm going to get all of my weapons from. Now, Germany, as an individual player, might try and fit into that gap. But it hasn't got the capacity or the industry to be able to do that. And so Europe has already made its choice. The EU has already made its choice in the digital space, in the security space. It's already made that choice in the values industry. And it's already made that choice in terms of trade. So I ask you, and I recommend that you reject this motion tonight. I don't disagree with some of the fabulous phrases that came out from the proposition tonight, that the US is a petulant thug, and that it is in its bellicose and its dotage. However, success and what the EU needs to try to achieve in the decades going forwards, unfortunately mean we've already hitched our wagon to that bellicose thug. And we cannot now turn back. On top of that, and this is maybe my most provocative thought for the evening, China might not choose the EU. And so with that this evening, I implore you to reject the motion of tonight.
Professor Jones for that fantastic speech. So the time has come for us to vote whether we are in favour or against the motion. In a few minutes I'll ask if you are in favour of side proposition. Aye. And if you are in favour of side opposition, you shout nay. So all those in favour of side proposition, shout aye. Aye. And all those in favour of side opposition, shout nay. No. Nay. The nays have that one, yeah. So the motion falls. There's a wine reception going on Combo now, so do go in, like, get your free fill and get another apple.